As you and I were getting into this conversation, we were talking about how while Mueller is obviously taking up a lot of headlines, trade's certainly dominating, and it does feel like maybe the USMCA, has gotten lost a little bit in the conversation. Tell us where you are right now with the push through Congress.
Look, the labor movements want to ensure that trade agreements benefit working people. This agreement right now, for it to be voted on, would be premature. And here's why, Jason. One of the problems under the old agreement was that Mexico kept their wages artificially low. In this agreement, they say they have to change their laws, effectively enforce it, and then dedicate resources to it. Until they get that done, this agreement won't be anywhere near ripe for voting on. If we vote on it before they do that, their incentive to do those things goes away, exactly like it did in Colombia. So we're saying don't vote at all until you put these things in place. And then we still have other problems with enforcement.
So tell us, what exactly you need to hear, who you need to hear it from in order to get behind this. Because as you say, you've been pretty clear in saying we're not behind this if this goes to an early vote.
Well, the Mexican government, one, has to change their laws. Then they have to start effectively enforcing them. And then they have to demonstrate that they have the resources necessary to enforce those laws. Because if you can't enforce a trade agreement, it is useless. The second part of enforcement is the agreement as drafted so far actually takes a step backwards when it comes to enforcement. Previously, whenever you had Mexico or the United States had a disagreement, they would first talk to each other, and if they couldn't resolve that dispute, they would put together a group of people called a panel. They were like arbitrators, and they would decide the dispute, and then it was binding on people. The new agreement says that either party can block the panel. So either party can block the arbitrator and you can never get a decision. That means it's unenforceable. So we need a way for workers to enforce these laws in all three countries so that we can make this agreement work for working people and not just bankers.
All right, well, what you're describing feels like a pretty big piece of this. So do we need to reopen negotiations at this point among the three countries?
Well, there's two ways that you get the enforcement. One is in the enabling legislation, and that can help us domestically. But in order to be able to get the enforcement we need and not just rely on hopes and wishes, and we think they'll do it or we hope they'll do it, then we're going to have a mechanism that allows us to enforce that. All three parties will have to agree to that. It's not in place yet. It must be in place or this agreement's unenforceable.
And so as you talk to your friends up there on Capitol Hill, give us a sense of what's being talked about in the halls. Are you feeling like there is a growing movement for or against? Are you convincing people that this is not the right thing? What are you hearing?
Well, I think what we hear on the Hill is the same thing we're saying. It's not ready to be voted on yet because you don't have all the mechanisms in place. We don't know what the enabling legislation is going to do, for instance. It's not enforceable because the agreement itself takes a step backwards from it was before. It's like having an arbitration proceeding that doesn't go to arbitration, so you can never settle anything. That has to be resolved, and I think there's a great appetite up on the Hill to have an agreement that is enforceable and ripe for enforcement. And until that happens, I think there'll be significant resistance to this agreement, and I think it would be a major mistake to vote on this agreement prematurely because we would miss a great opportunity to rewrite a bad trade agreement.
And so, Richard, I got to ask you, you travel around a lot. You travel on the weekends. You get to talk to folks at meetings. And like it or not, we are already in the thick of a presidential election, or at least the early stages of a presidential election. Labor, obviously, a key voice for both parties at this point, especially given what we saw in the last presidential election. What do you hear in terms of how the Democratic message is or isn't resonating as we see this dozen or so candidates out in the field?
Well, first of all, I think workers everywhere I go want to hear how a candidate is going to address their issues, kitchen table economics. What are you going to do for health care? What are you going to do for education? What are you going to do to raise our wages? What are you going to do to create more opportunities? What are you going to do to make education more affordable? And I think that's being debated out there. It's starting to bubble up. There's a lot of great ideas. Our people are excited about having the opportunity to actually touch a candidate and find out what that candidate really stands for. And we're going to encourage that. We're going to encourage those candidates to come and walk a day with our members. Do what we do for a day so you know how workers live and how our communities are. Look at our schools. Talk about our jobs. Look at health and safety. And I got to tell you, they are really excited about having the opportunity to talk to people about those issues that affect them the most.
Anybody taking you up on that offer so far?
I think all of them will. We're just in the process of planning it. I think most of the candidates will, if not all of them.
And so just before I let you go, got to go back to the trade agreement for a second. What's the next big move for you? What do you need to see? What's the next catalyst for action from your perspective?
Well, we continue to work with Ambassador Lighthizer to make sure that this agreement doesn't get voted on before it's ripe or mature for voting. And then we're trying to work with him to make sure that we get real enforcement mechanisms. I'm hopeful that we can get that done so that we can rid ourselves of a really bad agreement. NAFTA was designed to give global employers power over their workers in all the countries. And that's what caused a lot of the wage stagnation in all the countries around the world, particularly Canada, US, and Mexico. And we want to change that. So we're working hard to get that done, and hopefully we'll be able to get it done before it's voted on, and we'll be able to support it.
Real quickly, do you feel like Lighthizer is listening to you?
We've had a working relationship with him, yes.